Good morning, campers. We're back for another look at our microbiology text by Tortora, and we're going to take a look at chapter 24, microbial diseases of the respiratory system, and we'll probably break this one into two parts also. So this will be part one of chapter 24. There's our beautiful micrograph to kick off our chapter of chlamydial bacteria. So first we'll take a look at the respiratory system. There's the upper respiratory system, which is everything superior or towards the head from the larynx, the voice box, and then everything below the larynx is the lower respiratory system. So the upper respiratory system includes nose, pharynx, nasal cavity, probably a better term, pharynx, which is the throat, so-called, the middle ear, and the tubes that connect the middle ear to the pharynx, the eustachian tubes. Saliva and tears are present to protect those mucosal surfaces. Lower respiratory tract is everything below, so the larynx, the trachea, the primary bronchi, all the branching bronchial tubes and bronchioles, the small ones, and the microscopic air sacs, the alveoli. As you know, the ciliary escalator is there to sweep mucus on the surface of all those bronchi and bronchioles up out of the lungs to be swallowed down. Keep the place sterile, so it's largely sterile in the lower respiratory tract. Here's just a quick diagram. The nasal cavity. You can see these nasal turbinates or concha that give some extra surface area for humidifying and warming the air as it comes in, and also capturing any debris and microbes. And the air moves then into the pharynx. Excuse me. It's the throat, right? This cylindrical space here. And then it passes by a trap door, a valve, a flap of tissue called the epiglottis. And every time you swallow, the epiglottis folds down over the opening to the larynx right here, and that gives way to the trachea, so-called windpipe, and air then moves down into the lungs. So everything down here has no microorganisms or not for any extended period of time. They'll be swept out with the mucus and then swallowed down. The neighboring passageway is the esophagus right here. So the epiglottis serves to make sure that nothing from the oral cavity that's meant to go down to the esophagus ever goes down into the trachea. The lower respiratory tract, you can see here, includes, here's the larynx, that's the sort of geographic cutoff, and the trachea, the primary bronchi, all the branching bronchi, and finally to some very small bronchioles, and then to the alveoli. And the alveoli, again, are air sacs that are covered with blood capillaries so that gases can diffuse back and forth from blood to alveoli and vice versa. The diaphragm muscle is one of the respiratory muscles that helps inflate the lungs. There's a lining on the surface of each lung, and then an identical lining facing it on the cavity in which the lungs lie, the pleural cavities, and those linings allow the lungs to glide effortlessly as they expand and contract, and they can become inflamed, and we'll make just a mention of that at one time. So, normal microbiota suppress pathogens. It's like everywhere else that we've talked about. They're very helpful because they keep transient pathogens that happen to come into the respiratory system from getting a foothold. They can't compete with all the existing commensals that are there. Again, the lower respiratory system has no microbes except momentarily. If you inspire some into your airways, they'll be swept out with the mucus relatively quickly. If we do get an infection in the upper respiratory system, some terminology: pharyngitis, sore throat, right? That's the throat, that space behind the nasal and oral cavities and the larynx. Laryngitis, inflammation in the larynx, the voice box, and it affects your sounds of speech. Tonsillitis. The tonsils are some lymphoid tissue. There's patches of lymphoid tissue here, and then also some up here in the pharynx, so-called adenoids. Those are important lymphoid tissues regions that help sample what's coming in your diet in order to get a leg up on defending you against it. But they can get inflamed. Can have a big inflammation in the tonsils, causing them to swell up, and they can even start to occlude the airway if they get too swollen in there. So we'll see. Sinusitis. Also looking back at this picture, I could have mentioned there's air-filled spaces lined with this the same ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium of the nasal cavity and the airways in several bones of your cranium, and they're continuous with the nasal cavity, so air can go in and out of these spaces, and they are resonating chambers that help contribute to the sounds of your speech. So if they become inflamed, if some microbes get up into those sinuses, they'll cause sinusitis. The hounds are restless. Sorry about that. So those sinuses can become inflamed, and actually they can get closed off by inflammation, and fluid can be trapped in there and cause an infection called sinusitis. Epiglottitis. The epiglottis itself, that flap of tissue that folds down over the larynx when you swallow, can become inflamed and thickened so that it doesn't fold down and bend properly. But the worst thing is it starts to occlude the entry of air into the trachea, and people with epiglottitis have a strange sound they make when they're attempting to breathe, because the air will make a whistling sound as it passes through the very narrow opening left at the entrance of the larynx. Some picture of some staph bacteria on the ciliated epithelium of the airways. So, diseases of the upper respiratory system. Streptococcal pharyngitis is our first candidate. Strep pyogenes we're talking about. Those are called Group A streptococci, as defined by the Lansfield system of naming various strep species. Excuse me. They have a capsule that makes them resistant to phagocytosis. They have some toxins. They produce streptokinases, which can dissolve blood clots, and they have streptolysins, which kill cells. And these are some of the virulence factors they have that allow them to cause disease. Cause local inflammation and fever and tonsillitis. They get into the tonsils and start a battle within the immune tissue there, and they cause enlarged lymph nodes, swollen glands. People often call them. They're not glands, they're lymph nodes, but there's lymph nodes in the neck, and they can become inflamed. Remember, lymph nodes are lymphoid tissue containing lots and lots of immune cells. You can produce a rash also with it. Diagnosis is by rapid antigen detection tests. And scarlet fever. Some strains of S. pyogenes carry the erythrogenic toxin, which causes this redness. Can cause a red color of this coloration of the skin. More about strep pharyngitis. It can cause autoimmune responses, and rheumatic fever is an autoimmune response to S. pyogenes infection. So about 2 to 4 weeks after the strep pyogenes infection, you can get rheumatic fever. So rheumatic fever involves joint inflammation, right? Some antigens that were attacked when the bacteria was being cleared by the immune system, then mistakenly attack some antigens in the joints, in the kidneys, heart valves. Endocarditis can be caused by, in this situation, inflammation and then heart valve damage following that. So who gets rheumatoid arthritis? Children, usually around 2 to 14 years of age. And this is mostly a problem in developing countries because there was such a problem with rheumatic fever and strep infections in this country over a couple of generations, or probably many generations actually. Antibiotics were developed that were successful against these guys. Then there was a special effort made to screen for strep infections to make sure people didn't carry them for a long time. Generally, people who are treated with antibiotics for strep pharyngitis do not go on to get rheumatic fever. It's untreated strep infections that lead to rheumatic fever. So in this country, now there's rapid strep tests that can give you a 15-minute answer if you take your child into the pediatrician because they have a sore throat. You can have that check for strep right away and give that antibiotic and prevent the complications. There's a picture of the reddened, swollen pharynx and tonsils in the pharynx of someone with this pharyngitis. Okay, another disease, diphtheria. Corynebacterium diphtheriae, gram-positive rods. They produce a diphtheria toxin. When lysogenized, they receive this gene from viruses, and now they have the ability to cause disease. The exotoxin kills epithelial cells, and it's very, very potent, and it's treated when someone has diphtheria. They treat not only with antibiotics, but with antitoxin antibody preparation, because so toxic is that exotoxin. Characteristic of this disease, a grayish membrane of dead cells, fibrin, and white blood cells forms on the surface of the pharynx and a swollen neck. So if we look ahead, well, I guess it's too far ahead. We'll see it come up in a bit. This grayish membrane in the back of the throat, it looks like it's maybe just something you could scrape off, but that doesn't work at all. Trying to scrape it off causes severe bleeding. So it's a bad situation, very, very much inflamed back there and can interfere with breathing. We don't have this in our society now because of the DTaP vaccine. Diphtheria, tetanus, and acellular pertussis vaccine has chopped up pertussis bacteria, and that's a very relatively good vaccine, good immunization, good immunity. There is such a thing as cutaneous diphtheria. That title didn't mean to get shrunken down like that, but you can get skin ulcers produced by this bacteria also. But what it's known for is its respiratory infections. And there's the pictures of the bacteria. They sometimes form little rows of columns called the palisade arrangement of bacteria. That's common to this as a part of the sort of microscopic diagnosis of this infection. Otitis media, the middle ear, deep to the tympanic membrane, right? If you just probe into the outer ear, then there's the tympanic membrane forms the boundary between the outer ear and the middle ear, and that middle ear can become inflamed and can have infections in there. The most common causes are Streptococcus pneumoniae, Haemophilus influenza, Moraxella, and Strep pyogenes. Also respiratory syncytial viruses. Excuse me. This is common in babies and young children, and it has to do with the dimensions and the orientation of their tympanopharyngeal tube. I say that backwards anyway. Eustachian tube, these authors are calling it. It's that passageway from the middle ear down to the pharynx, and so anyway, bacteria can get up into that middle ear and then trapped in there, and then fluid during inflammation accumulates in there and forms a medium for the bacteria to grow, and a painful infection can grow inside there. Pressure builds up and presses on the tympanic membrane. Very, very painful for children and causing a lot of discomfort. Some children get repeated otitis media infections. Every time they get a cold, they go on to have a complication of secondary infection there, and it can be very difficult for young parents and for babies. Here's a bulging eardrum, some tympanic membrane bulging out because on the other side is an inflammation, expanding volume of material in the middle ear. Solution for chronic middle ear infections in babies is to take a little knife and make a nick in the tympanic membrane. Sounds kind of sketchy, right? And insert a little rubber grommet right into the membrane. This little grommet will pop through the membrane, and it has a little cuff that holds on either side and keeps an opening there so that fluid can't accumulate in there and provide that medium for the growth of bacteria. So all the pus will ooze out and then no more ear infections will happen. Eventually that little grommet will fall out on its own during later childhood. Common colds. I'm just getting over a common cold. Didn't feel very common to me. Felt pretty miserable. Over 200 different viruses called common colds. Most notable are rhinoviruses and coronaviruses. And I don't have to tell you about coronaviruses. And enterovirus D68, another one that's causing common colds. Sneezing, nasal secretion, congestion, those are the hallmarks of the common cold, can lead to laryngitis and secondary otitis media. There's no fever. That's one of the ways to distinguish it from influenza and other kinds of infections. No use for antibiotics. People frequently either take their children or they go themselves to the doctor's office and demand to have antibiotics because they don't feel good, and they're abusing antibiotics. When they do that, oftentimes doctors are tired and pressed for time and just go ahead and prescribe it, and it's not a good idea. You don't need antibiotics or can't use antibiotics when you get a cold. The length of duration of a cold is the length of duration of a secondary immune response. Let me start that again. Primary immune response, a active immune response, 7 days or so. If you decide to take vitamin C lozenges or zinc lozenges to treat the cold, the approximate duration of that will then be 1 week. Hope you get the humor. Diseases of the upper respiratory system. Here's a little question. A patient presents with fever and a red sore throat. A grayish membrane appears on the throat. Gram-positive rods are cultured from the membrane. What do you think it is? And I think you can tell me right now. Just a few seconds ago, we were talking about a diphtheria. And those are the gram-positive bacteria we're talking about in that case. And there's just a summary list of things here that we've been talking about. Epiglottitis, just to remind you, if things progress to epiglottitis, that's a medical emergency and needs to be treated immediately because it'll interfere with breathing. There's a whole interesting bunch of information related to signs of someone with epiglottitis, but you will hear this sort of wheezing sound as they attempt to breathe. They'll be hunched forward, trying to keep their epiglottises open as much as possible. All right. So how about the lower respiratory system? Bronchitis. If you get bronchitis, you have inflammation in the bronchi, all the air passageways that keep branching down farther and farther down into the lungs from the trachea. You're going to get inflammation farther down in the real small bronchi called bronchioles, bronchiolitis. Pneumonia is when you get an infection right down in the air sacs, the microscopic air sacs of your lungs. That's a pretty severe condition because now inflammation is happening right in that area of the lungs where you desperately need for survival to exchange oxygen and CO2 in your lungs. Pertussis. Bordetella pertussis bacteria causes a disease called whooping cough. It's called that because it causes such a severe cough in children that they cough so rapidly they're forced to inhale air between coughs at a tremendous velocity, and it produces a almost musical sound, the whoop of whooping cough. So there's multiple stages of it. Well, the Bordetella pertussis produces a capsule which helps evade phagocytosis and helps it attach to the cells in the trachea, and it produces a tracheal cytotoxin that kills the epithelial cells and shuts off the ciliary escalator, so the mucus is now stuck down. It's being produced in extra amounts of inflammation, and it's not being swept out of the airways. There's also a very bad pertussis toxin, which gets into the bloodstream and inhibits immune responses and has a number of effects on the body. So major bad bacteria, a lot of pretty high mortality rate in children of whooping cough. So there's multiple stages to the disease. Jumping ahead of myself a second ago, there's the catarrhal stage. That's the stage when catarrhal means all the secretions that are normally associated with a cold. Your nose is running and you have all kinds of mucus in your throat and in your nasal cavity and so forth, in your pharynx. There's the paroxysmal stage, which is violent coughing. And that's when you hear the whoops, because the gasping for air in between coughs, just nonstop coughing. Fast as the air can be brought in, more coughs. Can't stop. Very, very difficult, can cause hypoxia actually in children. Then there's the convalescent stage and may last for a while. It's again, we have the DTaP vaccine, a cellular pertussis vaccine that you mentioned already, treatment with erythromycin and macrolides kill these guys off. Just a little aside, I did talk about bioterrorism, a couple of examples of not necessarily terrorism, but biocrime, weaponization of microbes in the last chapter. But just some other histories, maybe some of these things were mentioned. In 1346, plague-ridden bodies were used by the Tatars to during the siege of Ukraine or Kaffa, threw those bodies in there and caused a Black Death pandemic that swept through Europe for a couple of years and killed a tremendous number of people. 18th century, smallpox, contaminated blankets used against Native Americans. I hesitate to even consider the dastardly nature of that behavior. Smallpox killed off a huge number of Native Americans because they had no immunity against it, and also was because they had a disease with a super high mortality rate. Plague-carrying flea bombs were used during the Chinese-Japanese War, Sino-Japanese War, right at the beginning, preceding World War II. Biological weapons banned in the 20th century. A couple of international bodies have gotten together and banned the production and stockpiling of biological weapons for warfare. It's a little bit funny because war is war, and war is about mass destruction and the ruthless killing of people. So how are we going to expect aggressors in wartime to adhere to these kind of things? But that's what we have. And more radical groups are turning to bioterrorism. There was a group in Japan that released a nerve gas into a busy Tokyo train station during rush hour. It killed a number of people. Anthrax attacks, I mentioned, in the United States Congress by way of letters sent through the postal system. So more and more of a thing. So there's some organisms that have been listed as potential bioweapons by the Department of Homeland Security, a particular branch whose job it is to kind of keep track of these things. And some of them, we've talked about quite a bit about some of these pathogens, and you can imagine how bad it would be if large quantities were produced and disseminated in the population. There's a couple of examples of Bacillus anthracis, anthrax, endospores, if they could be dispensed and got into people's lungs, be lethal. Ebola, we know that's a horribly high mortality rate. Viral hemorrhagic virus infection, and cholera causes a life-threatening diarrheal disease. So all kinds of work is being done to develop technologies for identifying potential threats. ProStrip's rapid screening system for a whole bunch of different likely agents that is rolled out for to have available for emergency testing. We don't need to go into great detail. You can study microbial forensics. It's a whole part of forensics nowadays, and that's really who handles all this kind of stuff and is interested in this kind of stuff in the Department of Homeland Security. All right, tuberculosis. It's a lower respiratory infection caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, an acid-fast rod obligate aerobe. It has a very long generation time, just like we talked about Mycobacterium leprae earlier, 20-hour generation time. So it's a very slow-growing agent. And again, it likes to grow at slightly cooler temperatures. It likes to be in your lungs. It's cooler in your lungs than elsewhere in your body because you keep on inspiring air that's been somewhat warmed in your larynx or in your nasal cavity, but not completely. So it's a little cooler in there. It doesn't dry out in the air sacs because of its lipids in its cell wall. There's other agents, a more mild disease caused by Mycobacterium bovis. And here's a stain, acid-fast stain showing those tubercles in there, or those bacilli in there. So what happens? You inhale the organisms, and they get phagocytosed by alveolar macrophages. There's a whole population of macrophages in the alveolar, in the air sacs of your lungs. but they can survive in there, and they stimulate inflammation. The mycolic acids trigger inflammation. They survive and grow in the macrophages, and a whole bunch of more macrophages come migrating in and kind of wall the whole thing off and form a ball that's sealed off. There may even be some collagen in there. They even become calcified, so you have these hard spherical chambers forming in your lungs with live tuberculosis bacteria in the center, and the center starts to cavitate, and it starts to break down in the center and liquefy in there, and you have bacteria in there, and eventually that center will become filled with air. The bacteria can then really go to town, multiplying in there. And there's a latency period while this is all happening, and while those tubercles, those spherical chambers of bacteria in your lungs hang out, and eventually they'll break back open and spread the bacteria throughout your body. The tubercle will someday break down and release the bacteria. That's called miliary tuberculosis. Miliary tuberculosis, when it's disseminated in the body, and that can cause fatal infection. So here's a cool little diagram just showing you. In comes a bacterium, gets into an alveolus. I'm not sure why this alveolus looks more like a tube than a sac, but anyway, that's all right. I'm sure they had an idea. And then a whole bunch of macrophages. Well, this macrophage grabs that bacteria and gobbles it up, and a whole bunch more macrophages are attracted by the inflammatory nature of the bacterium as it continues to divide and escape from phagocytes, and it becomes trapped in this mass of macrophages and forms this tubercle. Cache's center is what's called the liquefied center of this tubercle, where the bacteria are living, where they've killed some macrophages down in there, and eventually the thing may break open and cause that miliary disease, where the bacteria are going to escape into the airways, then into the bloodstream, and travel throughout the body. The tuberculosis skin test, we have done a very good job of getting tuberculosis under control in this country through numerous means, one of which is doing regular tuberculin skin tests. It's a skin test that everyone gets when they apply for a job. When you go to get a job, the companies that hire you will be required to do a tuberculin test. It's a type 4 hypersensitivity reaction, delayed type hypersensitivity reaction. So they'll inoculate your skin with a little needle with a bunch of tuberculosis antigen, and 3 days later, so you'll come back and they'll take a look at the skin patch, and if you have tuberculosis or have had or been immunized against it, you'll have a big inflammation there, just like a poison ivy inflammation. If you're positive, you'll be followed by X-ray and CT scans to take a look and see if those tubercles are in there. And then also look do a acid-fast stain of some sputum, rapid blood test for interferon gamma and nucleic acid amplification tests. In other words, looking for the genome of that bacteria in your body, in your sputum, in your body. So here's a picture of a positive tuberculin skin test, and a normal person you wouldn't even be able to see it anymore from where they would have put a mark on the skin probably where it was given, and typically, and then come back and do it, and they'll check it out and see if there's a real good blister forming there from all the skin damage from that delayed type hypersensitivity reaction. So treatment, 6 months minimum of multiple drug treatments to kill these guys, and that's a big problem, getting people to comply. You'd be surprised how hard it is to get people to comply with a daily drug regimen every single day for months. They just start feeling better, and they just lose interest or lose even remembrance of doing it, and it drops away, and we have recurrence of disease and antibiotic resistance. First line drugs, isoniazid, rifampin, and ethambutol are probably the most commonly used ones. Pyrazinamide also, so these are drugs that are used in combination, at least 2 at a time, to try to get these things kill these bacteria, prevent them from making their mycolic acid cell wall and so forth. Second line drugs, fluoroquinolones, ciprofloxacin is a fluoroquinolone, streptomycin, para-aminosalicylic acid. Multi-drug resistant strains are becoming more and more common. In fact, probably most likely if you get infected with tuberculosis, that's what it'll be. So you have to constantly keep on reaching into the reservoir of antibiotics to find ways to kill these things. Excuse me. There's becoming, in parts of the world, such as in India, there's a growing um, prevalence of TB bacteria that are resistant to all known antibiotics. This is a real serious problem. It's only a matter of time before these bugs become entrenched in the United States. And they, again, are absolutely antibiotic resistant. We're going to be in a lot of trouble. A lot of research goes into trying to find new antibiotics that work by different mechanisms so that we can catch some of these organisms that become resistant to everything we've got. It's a prevalent disease. 10 million people get tuberculosis annually, 2 million deaths. That's a pretty lot. 1/3, it's estimated, of the world's population has latent TB in their lungs. They don't know it because they don't feel sick. There's no symptoms, right? They're just those tubercles are sitting dormant in the lungs. People with HIV are highly susceptible to it, and instead of being walled off, it just goes haywire in their body, grows unobstructed, and causes death. The BCG vaccine is used in many parts of the world against tuberculosis bacteria. We don't use it in the United States. There's been questions about how well it actually works, but one of the advantages of not using it in the United States is that you can use the tuberculin test to identify people that have been infected with TB. If you have been vaccinated, you'll get a positive test, but you won't have been necessarily a carrier. And so easier to keep things clear without putting this vaccine into great use. You can see where tuberculosis is most common, most prevalent in the world. Large places where there's large populations, and also a lot of people with disease. I don't know what the value of that graph really is. All right, well, let's cut it there, and we'll start up in just a few minutes with another session on Chapter 24, Microbial Diseases of the Respiratory System.